welcome to the deep dive. We are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today for what promises to be, an incredibly intense and thought-provoking exploration.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be unapologetic, that's for sure.
Exactly. But before we jump into the thick of it, please take just a quick second to like and subscribe to our channel.
Right, it really helps.
It is the absolute best way to ensure you never miss a deep dive. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these, really thorough analyses of the most talked about texts out there.
Absolutely.
So today, we are focusing our lens on a brand new, highly controversial release. It's an exclusive, ultra-long, and incisive review of the 2025 ebook, Men Going Their Own Way, Rejecting Feminist Oppression by Conrad Riker.
And if you want to read along or, verify the staggering statistics we're going to cover today,
Which you should.
yeah, definitely go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing commentary. He posts a lot of follow-up material there.
He really does.
Yeah.
It is a text that it demands a highly meticulous unpacking. The scope of what Riker attempts to dismantle here is, it's massive.
Decades of legal and cultural shifts, right?
Decades. Legal, cultural, sociological. He covers it all.
Right. Now, to immediately hook those of you listening who might be part of the target demographic for this text, if you are interested in the men's rights movement, or if you're deeply familiar with the red pill philosophy.
Or the broader manosphere in general.
Exactly. If you follow those conversations, this deep dive is going to be an essential, completely unfiltered exploration into the history of our modern institutions.
Before they were captured.
Right. Well, we are going to examine the book's highly controversial central claim at these very institutions, from family courts to education systems, down to corporate HR departments.
Have been systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Yes, and that this capture occurred right under our noses before society even realized what was happening. The author positions this book as a definitive roadmap for men looking to reclaim their inherent masculinity and independence in what he calls an increasingly hostile modern world.
And it's a roadmap that does not pull a single punch. The text is aggressive, it's highly structured, and it makes these sweeping, meticulously argued assertions about the fundamental reality of gender dynamics today.
It completely rejects the mainstream consensus.
Completely.
Which brings us to our core mission for this deep dive. Our goal today is to unpack Riker's boldest assertions, looking at everything from what he provocatively calls the marriage plantation to his deep evolutionary arguments regarding the biological imperatives of male leadership.
But first, a crucial disclaimer.
Yes, very important. Just as a reminder to you listening, our job today is to dive into the text itself. We aren't taking sides or endorsing the political viewpoints within.
We are simply here to impartially report on the fascinating arguments Riker presents.
Exactly, so you can fully understand this specific growing perspective. We are your analytical guides through the source material, nothing more and nothing less. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To start us off, most of our listeners are already highly familiar with the base concept of taking the red pill. But Riker takes the Matrix metaphor a step further here by tying it directly to modern institutions.
He really does.
How does his definition of the red pill matrix differ from the standard definition we usually see?
Well, the way Riker elevates this concept is entirely focused on systemic architecture.
Not just dating dynamic.
Right, exactly. The term often gets bogged down in interpersonal dating stuff. He utilizes the familiar metaphor of the 1999 film The Matrix, but he applies it to macro-level societal conditioning.
So the core of his argument rests on the idea that modern society operates essentially as a highly calibrated red pill matrix.
Yes, according to the book, this isn't just a vague cultural feeling. It is a pervasive, invisible, legally codified system.
And it actively conditions men to accept their own systemic oppression as completely normal.
Normal and expected. But the truly insidious part, according to Riker, is that this system operates while simultaneously force-feeding men the narrative that they are the uniquely privileged demographic.
That is the ultimate cognitive dissonance he's pointing to, isn't it?
It's massive.
The text asserts that society relentlessly tells men they hold all the cards, that history was built for them, but the reality on the ground, in his view, is exactly the opposite.
Precisely. Riker uses the character of Neo waking up from his pod as a direct, visceral parallel to the modern man's journey of realization.
Waking up to this specific red pill means swallowing a bitter, deeply uncomfortable truth.
Which is that concept of male privilege in the 21st century is an absolute fabricated myth.
A myth. And Riker asserts that this myth wasn't an accident.
No, he says it was deliberately designed and propagated by feminist ideologies to keep men subservient
Completely complacent.
and constantly apologizing for their very existence. He builds this chapter around the premise that real privilege isn't about historical gender roles.
Right. It's not about who sat on thrones 300 years ago.
Exactly. Privilege is about actual functional day-to-day power in the modern era. And in today's gynocratic society, as he terms it, women hold the ultimate, unassailable power.
What's fascinating here is how he contrasts perceived power with applied power.
Right, yeah, go on.
Well, he is incredibly specific about where that power is concentrated. He doesn't just make a blanket statement. He points directly to family courts, mainstream media narratives, and the court of public opinion.
He argues that these are the true arenas of power today.
It's not about who the CEO of a company is. It's about who has the power to destroy a life with a single accusation. And he argues men are losing in every single one of these modern arenas.
What's fascinating here is his deep dive into that dynamic. He asserts that women are the ones who can fundamentally destroy a man's hard-earned reputation with an unverified accusation.
They win primary custody of children almost by default in the legal system.
And they completely dictate the cultural narrative through overwhelming media representation.
So to Reicher, being constantly told you are a privileged oppressor while you are systematically disadvantaged,
And treated as a second-class citizen in these crucial, life-altering arenas.
that is the ultimate illusion of the red pill matrix. It's a system designed to make you grateful for the boot on your neck.
It's a remarkably heavy concept for you listening to consider.
It really is. Riker wants you to deeply examine how this societal conditioning shapes your own daily interactions.
Your career choices, your fundamental self-perception.
He asks a very potent, targeted question early in the text. Why do so many men today feel incredibly disenfranchised, chronically stressed, and entirely marginalized despite the mainstream narrative constantly repeating that they possess a distinct inherent male advantage?
Right. If you're continually told you're winning the game of life, but you feel like you're losing everything, your income, your peace of mind, your cultural standing, Riker argues that is the matrix functioning exactly as it was designed to.
And because he is offering a roadmap, he doesn't just leave the reader in a state of despair. He introduces this operational idea of the red pill cycle.
It's a multi-stage process.
It's not just about waking up and being perpetually angry on internet forums.
Which he actually heavily critiques as a waste of male energy.
Yes, he does. According to the book, the cycle begins with a stark awareness of this systemic bias.
And that painful awareness must then be transmuted into tangible action.
Action, meaning taking absolute control of your life, fiercely protecting your legal and financial rights.
And vocally pushing back against the prevailing narrative in your own circles.
And finally, the cycle completes when that definitive action serves to implicitly inspire other men to break free from their own conditioning,
It's designed to be a cascading effect of awakening.
moving from passive consumer to active architect of your own reality, which brings us perfectly to the practical application of this awakening. If men are waking up, what exactly are they waking up to?
That's the big question of Chapter 1.
You mentioned he has the statistics to back up the marriage plantation claim. What numbers are we actually looking at here? Because the phrasing alone is incredibly provocative.
The phrasing is deliberately incendiary because Riker believes the reality of the institution warrants it. He completely strips away the romanticism of marriage.
The text argues that modern marriage, under current legal frameworks, is no longer a partnership of equals, but a legally binding trap.
He essentially claims that married men are treated as indentured laborers.
Expected to toil away their entire productive lives to provide for families, only to be seamlessly stripped of their assets, their homes, and their dignity when the marriage inevitably ends.
The statistics he provides to anchor this claim are stark. According to the text, women initiate roughly 80% of all divorces today.
80%, that is a staggering majority.
It is. And Riker doesn't just drop that number. He analyzes the reasons behind it.
He argues that the vast majority of these divorces are not initiated for extreme breaches of the marriage contract, like abuse or infidelity.
Instead, he points out they are often initiated for incredibly vague, subjective reasons.
He cites legal filings dominated by phrases like general unhappiness, a lack of fulfillment, or irreconcilable differences.
Riker's framework suggests that men are being economically devastated simply because their partner experienced a shift in emotional weather, rather than any concrete wrongdoing by the husband.
And And the financial fallout he outlines following these subjective divorces is just absolutely devastating.
Riker states that men routinely lose 50 to 70% of their accumulated assets in a divorce.
50 to 70%. On top of that asset division, he notes the average upfront cost of a divorce in the United States is $15,000 per person.
And he makes it clear that this baseline figure doesn't even begin to include the ongoing, crippling legal fees regarding custody battles or alimony modifications.
Things that can drag out for literally years, completely bleeding a man dry.
To put a human face on these statistics, the book spends significant time detailing the anecdote of a man named John.
Riker paints a meticulous psychological portrait here.
He really does. John represents the archetype of the good soldier in modern society. He's described as a highly successful mechanical engineer, a man who did everything society told him a good, responsible man should do.
Riker details how John worked grueling 60-hour weeks.
Routinely missing out on his own personal leisure, all to provide a comfortable suburban life for his family.
John genuinely believed he was playing by the rules. He was honoring the traditional male contract of sacrificing present comfort for future stability and building a multi-generational legacy.
But the narrative shifts brutally. According to the story, John's wife filed for divorce, citing those exact, vague, irreconcilable differences we just talked about.
And Riker meticulously breaks down the legal machinery that was brought to bear against John. It wasn't just losing the house.
No, through the mechanics of asset division, mandated alimony calculations that completely ignored his wife's own earning potential.
And the forced liquidation of his retirement accounts to pay her legal fees.
John's life was systematically dismantled. Riker paints a picture of a man left with absolutely nothing but a tiny apartment, a mountain of legal bills, and a broken spirit.
John didn't just lose his current wealth, he lost his past labor and his future security.
Riker argues this shows how the system views men not as human beings experiencing a tragedy, but purely as financial utilities to be mined.
Completely enslaved by a system that favors women at every single procedural turn.
It's a harrowing, deeply detailed narrative that's meant to resonate on a very visceral level with the reader. He pairs John's financial devastation with another anecdote about a man named Mike.
Which shifts the focus to tackle what Riker calls the deadbeat dad myth.
If John's story is about the extraction of wealth, Mike's story is about the extraction of fatherhood.
Mike is portrayed as a fiercely dedicated father. He paid his court-ordered child support on time every single month without fail.
He spent tens of thousands of dollars fighting tooth and nail in the family courts just to secure standard visitation rights to see his own children.
Yet, despite doing everything right by the court's own metrics, Riker asserts the system still fundamentally treated Mike like a criminal suspect.
Every interaction with the court was fraught with suspicion. His parental rights were constantly minimized in favor of the mother's preferences.
And he was treated, at best, as a second-class parent or a weekend babysitter.
Riker argues this happens because the legal system inherently operates on an unwritten assumption that men are inherently dangerous or disposable, while women are infallible, natural caregivers.
If men are facing this level of inherent disadvantage in family court, it makes you wonder how the legal system got to this point in the first place. Does Riker trace where this institutional bias actually started?
He does, and it's a critical historical pivot point in his entire analysis. He points directly to the 1970s and the widespread introduction of no-fault divorce laws in the United States.
He argues that this was ground zero for the shift.
Exactly. While the mainstream narrative states that no-fault divorce was ostensibly introduced to make necessary separations less legally acrimonious and to free people from abusive marriages, Riker's analysis is completely different.
He argues that its actual, perhaps intended, effect was to entirely shift the balance of legal power in favor of women.
Because suddenly the fundamental contract of marriage could be unilaterally dissolved without having to prove any breach of contract or fault.
Precisely. Riker claims this legal shift fundamentally turned men into disposable utilities.
If a contract can be broken by one party at any time for any reason, and the state will step in to enforce the transfer of the other party's wealth to the person breaking the contract, it ceases to be a partnership.
Riker argues that men's lives, their accumulated capital, and their access to their children were suddenly and readily sacrificed on the altar of a very specific brand of female empowerment that prioritized female autonomy above male stability.
And Riker doesn't just look at the financial spreadsheets. He looks at the ultimate tragic human cost.
The book cites a truly chilling statistic to underscore the emotional toll of this disposability. Men's suicide rates are currently 3.5 times higher than women's.
But he goes further, pointing out that these suicide rates spike dramatically in the period immediately post-divorce.
He doesn't attribute this to men just being sad about a breakup.
No, he attributes this direct spike to the absolute emotional alienation and total financial devastation wrought by what he perceives as severe, unchecked family court bias.
He argues the state is literally driving men to the edge. So what does this all mean? Riker isn't just pointing out the problems and leaving the reader to wallow.
He offers very specific, hardline practical advice for the listener who might be navigating these waters or considering marriage.
According to the book, men must protect themselves preemptively and ruthlessly.
He strongly urges men to demand and sign ironclad prenuptial agreements before even considering walking down the aisle.
He explicitly tells men to reframe prenups in their minds. They are not unromantic, they are essential, non-negotiable shields against a highly exploitative legal system.
He also calls for men to actively organize and fight for default 50-50 shared parenting laws at the state legislative level.
Furthermore, he demands men become highly aware of what he calls the marriage tax, the unequal, massive, unseen risks and prices he claims only men pay for entering into the institution of modern marriage.
If we logically follow Riker's premise here, this idea of the family court being fundamentally weaponized leads directly into his next major and arguably broader argument in Chapter 3.
The concept of the gynocratic state and total institutional capture.
He argues that if you look closely, it's not just the institution of marriage that's broken, it's the entire macro-institutional framework of Western society.
Yes, he makes the sweeping case that feminist policies haven't just culturally influenced society over the last few decades, they have actively hijacked the core operational institutions.
Our public schools, our higher education systems, our justice system, and our corporate workplaces.
Riker claims these vital areas have been systematically turned into gynocratic strongholds.
In these spaces, he argues, a man is essentially presumed guilty until proven innocent.
And male competence is routinely punished if it threatens female advancement.
To help the reader understand the mechanics of how this happened, Riker provides a very specific historical timeline.
He traces the roots of this widespread institutional capture back to the cultural upheavals in the 1960s.
Specifically pinpointing the rise of highly organized feminist lobbying groups like NOW, the National Organization for Women.
He argues that these groups, which he claims were heavily funded by wealthy, out-of-touch elites, initially operated under the guise of pushing for basic policies of equality.
However, he details how, over the subsequent decades, as they gained entrenched bureaucratic power, those initial requests for equality quietly morphed into aggressive demands for structural female supremacy and the active penalization of men.
Let's drill down into the very specific examples he provides to prove this capture, starting with the education system, because his analysis here is deeply concerning for any man pursuing a degree.
Riker points to the 2014 Obama administration Dear Colleague letter as a massive, catastrophic turning point for civil rights on college campuses.
He discusses at length how Title IX, a federal law originally and explicitly intended to simply ensure equal funding and opportunities in collegiate sports, was completely weaponized by administrative bureaucrats.
He spends an entire subchapter arguing that Title IX was twisted from a shield into a sword.
It was used to mandate the creation of shadowy, campus-run tribunals to handle incredibly serious allegations of sexual misconduct.
The issue Riker highlights is that these tribunals operate entirely outside the actual legal system.
They lack the standard constitutional protections of due process. There is often no right to cross-examine the accuser, no strict rules of evidence.
And cases are decided on the lowest possible burden of proof, the preponderance of evidence.
To back up how dangerous this is, Riker cites a comprehensive 2017 study by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
This study found that a shocking 72% of top universities failed to provide even basic, adequate due process protections for accused students.
The human cost of this administrative overreach, according to the book, is absolutely devastating to young men.
To illustrate this, Riker shares the harrowing anecdote of a straight-A engineering student.
A young man with a spotless record, a full scholarship, and an incredibly bright future.
According to the text, this student was completely expelled, stripped of his academic credits, and had his reputation permanently ruined over a fabricated assault claim.
And the motive. Riker details that the claim was made by a female student purely as retaliation after he had politely rejected her romantic advances.
Riker emphasizes the darkest part of this story. Even after text messages surfaced proving the fabrication, the female accuser faced absolutely zero disciplinary consequences from the university.
While the young man's life and career trajectory were permanently derailed, the university simply washed its hands of him.
It's a terrifying scenario for any college student. And Riker connects this specific hostile anti-male environment directly to the macro-level demographic statistics we are currently seeing in higher education.
He notes that male college enrollment has plummeted drastically, now sitting at just 43% nationally and falling.
Men are abandoning higher education in droves.
Yet, Riker points out a glaring contradiction. Despite men now being the significant, shrinking minority on almost every college campus, affirmative action policies, diversity quotas, and massive institutional scholarships still overwhelmingly prioritize and fund female applicants.
He poses a rhetorical question to the reader that is hard to ignore. If the original stated goal of feminism was true equality, why aren't these massive institutions course-correcting or offering male-focused scholarships now that men are clearly the ones falling behind?
He argues the answer is simple. The goal was never equality. It was institutional dominance.
It's a highly compelling argument, and he asserts that this exact same dynamic has fundamentally captured the modern corporate workplace.
It's not just in the universities. Riker shares a very revealing personal anecdote from his own career in the corporate sector.
He describes a period where he worked grueling 80-hour weeks, leading complex projects, explicitly to earn a highly coveted executive promotion.
Yet the promotion was ultimately given to a female colleague who, Riker meticulously details, had significantly less experience, fewer successful projects, and objectively lower performance metrics.
When he pushed back and demanded a reason from HR, he was explicitly told behind closed doors that the decision was made from the top down to meet internal diversity and inclusion quotas.
This personal experience leads Riker to coin a broader sociological term, the gynocratic feedback loop.
The theory he lays out is that feminist policies implemented in the workplace and in higher education artificially elevate women into positions of administrative and managerial power.
This creates a larger entrenched base of empowered feminist voters and corporate decision makers.
These individuals, once in power, then push for even more aggressive, exclusionary feminist policies, like mandatory diversity hiring or biased HR grievance structures.
This, in turn, benefits even more women at the direct expense of highly competent men, perpetuating an endless cycle that continually marginalizes merit and male competence in favor of strict identity politics.
But perhaps the most jarring, indisputable example of institutional capture Riker presents is found within the ultimate arbiter of state power, the criminal justice system itself.
He doesn't rely on anecdotes here. He highlights a massive, peer-reviewed 2018 report straight from the U.S. Sentencing Commission.
The data in this report is staggering. It found that when controlling for all variables, including criminal history, men receive sentences that are, on average, 63% longer than women who are convicted of the exact same crimes.
A man and a woman commit the same fraud. The man goes to prison for years longer.
This raises an important question, and Riker asks it directly to the reader, demanding they think critically about the media they consume. Why does the mainstream media completely and utterly ignore this massive, provable sentencing gap, while simultaneously constantly amplifying the highly debated narrative of the gender wage gap?
Riker argues that this selective media outrage proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the societal concept of equality is only ever invoked when it can be used to benefit women.
When an inequality severely harms men, society collectively looks the other way.
He does highlight that there is some resistance forming, briefly mentioning the vital work of organizations like the National Coalition for Men.
He details how they fight relentless, grueling legal battles in the courts against these discriminatory policies.
Like challenging male-only draft registration or biased domestic violence resources.
But he argues they are fighting a massive uphill battle against a coordinated media machine that actively works against them at every turn.
Which brings us perfectly to Riker's deep analysis of the media in Chapter 8. He doesn't just call it bias. He describes it as an outright coordinated war on men.
Riker's argument in this chapter is foundational to his worldview. He posits that the media doesn't just passively reflect our culture, it actively engineers it.
It sets the boundaries of acceptable thought.
And he believes the mainstream media conglomerate is deliberately, systematically dismantling traditional male heroes and actively vilifying the core components of masculinity.
He takes direct aim at the ubiquitous term toxic masculinity.
He traces its origins, arguing that it was deliberately popularized by radical feminist academics with the specific goal of pathologizing traditional, biologically driven male traits like physical strength, competitive ambition, assertiveness, and emotional stoicism.
He calls the result of this media conditioning the masculinity paradox, and it's a trap I think many men listening will immediately recognize.
The media in modern society heavily and constantly criticize men for displaying traditional traits, demanding that men do the work, open up, act highly vulnerable.
And essentially process emotions exactly like women do.
But Riker fiercely asserts, the moment men actually comply, the moment they drop their guard, show weakness, or cry, they are instantly punished for it by both men and women.
They're perceived as weak, they lose the respect of their partners, their attractiveness plummets, and they are marginalized in their careers.
A brilliant, cruel double bind where men absolutely cannot win. They are told to be soft, but society only respects them when they are hard.
And he doesn't just make philosophical claims about the media. The statistics he brings in regarding media portrayal are very specific and revealing.
He cites a comprehensive 2020 study by the Men's Media Monitoring Project.
This study analyzed thousands of hours of television and film, and it revealed that 78% of overtly negative, incompetent, or malicious portrayals of men in modern media are actually written, produced, or directed by women.
Riker argues this isn't just an organic shift in storytelling. It is a calculated strategy within writers' rooms to generate controversy and clicks, while aggressively pushing an ideological agenda that elevates female characters by artificially tearing down male ones.
He illustrates the exact mechanics of this with what he calls the hero deconstruction model.
The book uses a very specific, widely recognized pop culture example to drive this home. The 2021 Disney Plus series, Loki.
Riker asks the reader to look at the history of the character. Historically, in the comic books and in Norse mythology, Loki was a cunning, dangerous, formidable force of chaos.
But Riker argues that in the modern show, the titular male character is systematically reduced to a bumbling, emotionally fragile, incompetent fool who constantly needs to be rescued.
Meanwhile, the female variant of the exact same character, Sylvie, is introduced and immediately portrayed as morally superior, hyper-competent, physically stronger, and constantly having to clean up his messes.
According to Riker, this is not an isolated incident of bad writing. It is deliberate cultural propaganda.
He argues it's designed to make way for new female protagonists, not by writing them compelling original heroes' journeys, but by actively humiliating and tearing down established male icons.
He points out that this exact same deconstruction happens in comedy too. He references massively popular award-winning sitcoms like Modern Family.
He breaks down how these shows consistently, almost exclusively, rely on the tired trope of the idiot, emotionally stunted, incompetent husband who is barely tolerated by the hyper-competent, infallible, constantly exasperated wife.
And Riker argues it extends far beyond fiction into how real-world news is framed and consumed by the public.
He notes a stark, undeniable double standard in journalistic framing. When a man commits a crime or an act of violence, the media immediately frames it as a systemic issue, an epidemic of toxic masculinity that indicts all men.
But when a woman commits a similarly heinous crime, Riker points out how the media bends over backward to frame it as an isolated tragedy, usually due to past trauma, mental health struggles, or an act of sheer desperation against an oppressive system.
The underlying message is clear. Men possess innate malice. Women possess extenuating circumstances.
So how does Riker suggest men navigate this incredibly hostile, omnipresent media landscape? He doesn't say to just turn off the TV.
He introduces a proactive concept he calls the media renaissance.
The media renaissance.
Yeah.
Riker strongly urges men to aggressively and consciously curate every single piece of media they consume.
He tells the listener to completely, unapologetically reject mainstream television, movies, and news outlets that rely on undermining male heroes.
Instead, he instructs men to actively seek out and financially support male-positive, independent media.
He references the absolute, undeniable, massive popularity of independent YouTube channels and long-form podcasts hosted by figures like Dr. Jordan Peterson or platforms dedicated to skill building like The Art of Manliness.
He uses the success of these platforms as a core piece of evidence. He argues that the billions of views and the massive financial support these independent creators generate prove beyond a doubt that the mainstream narrative is a lie.
Men are absolutely starving for content that celebrates rather than pathologizes traditional masculinity.
He also strongly encourages men to build libraries of classic films and literature stories that celebrate unapologetic courage, physical resilience, and unironic heroism.
And to make it a point to share those classics with their sons and nephews, actively inoculating the next generation against modern media conditioning.
It's all about actively taking back the cultural narrative.
Now, as we move into chapter 9 and beyond, Weicker shifts gears from diagnosing the external problems to exploring the foundational reasons why he believes this traditional masculinity is so utterly crucial to human survival.
He delves deep into evolutionary psychology and what he calls the biological imperative.
According to the book, the entire modern concept of a blank slate and absolute gender equality is a dangerous, anti-scientific myth.
Riker asserts that men and women are not interchangeable. They are biologically fundamentally different.
They are complementary, yes, but he argues that men are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to lead, to conquer environments, to build structures, and to aggressively provide.
He argues that the modern, hyper-comfortable world has engineered a devastating complacency trap for men.
Society, with its cubicles and endless entertainment, tells men to sit still, be quiet, avoid risk, and be perfectly content with absolute mediocrity.
But Riker argues that suppressing these deep, natural male instincts to build, to struggle, and to dominate one's environment doesn't make men peaceful.
It leads directly to the skyrocketing rates of depression, anxiety, and the profound, crushing aimlessness we see in so many young men today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of evolutionary psychology that Riker maps out, the book really digs into this specific neurological concept of the male brain.
He isn't just speaking metaphorically. Riker argues that men have literally been the primary problem solvers and engineers of humanity for millennia.
He points to specific evolutionary adaptations that give men distinct, measurable advantages in complex spatial reasoning, rapid risk assessment, and hyperlogical, unemotional thinking under extreme pressure.
To make this abstract evolutionary concept relatable to a modern reader, Riker brilliantly uses the example of video games, specifically the highly acclaimed puzzle game Portal.
This game heavily rewards complex spatial reasoning, understanding physics, and pure logical deduction.
He argues it's no surprise that men naturally excel at and overwhelmingly gravitate toward these types of intense mechanical challenges.
It's not socialization. It's because their brains are evolutionarily inclined and rewarded by dopamine when conquering these specific types of problems.
And he backs up this neurological argument with jaw-dropping historical examples of male leadership under extreme life-or-death duress.
He points to the legendary Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton.
Riker spends pages detailing the crisis. When Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was completely crushed by Antarctic ice, leaving his crew stranded in the most hostile environment on Earth, Shackleton didn't call a committee meeting.
He didn't ask everyone to sit in a circle and process their feelings about the ice.
Riker emphasizes that Shackleton tapped into pure, unfiltered male leadership. He took decisive, calculated, and absolute dictatorial control.
He prioritized logic and survival over comfort, leading his men through impossible odds across frozen oceans to ultimate survival without losing a single man.
Riker argues this is the peak, undeniable expression of the male brain operating in crisis mode, a mode society desperately relies on but currently demonizes.
Conversely, Riker offers a very sharp, pointed critique of modern historical revisionism in media, specifically pointing to critically acclaimed movies like Hidden Figures.
Now, while he explicitly acknowledges and respects the individual contributions of the female mathematicians involved in the space program, his critique is about the macro narrative.
He argues that the media deliberately weaponizes these outlier narratives to obscure and downplay a fundamental historical reality.
That men have historically been the absolute overwhelming backbone of engineering, advanced mathematics, and technological advancement for centuries.
He argues society is trying to rewrite history to make male achievement seem less exceptional.
And it's not just about the brain. Riker talks extensively about the necessary physical reality of the male body and spirit.
He totally aggressively rejects the modern body positivity movement.
He frames it not as a movement of self-love, but as an insidious societal push for complacency, physical weakness, and the celebration of sheer mediocrity.
He challenges the listener directly. Reject weakness, reject the dad bod, hit the gym with religious fervor, and sculpt the physical resilience and intimidating presence that your biology meant for you to have.
This physical demand ties perfectly into what he calls the ethical renaissance.
Riker advocates for a hard return to ancient Stoicism and a strict, unforgiving male code of honor, personal accountability, and raw courage.
He shares a very compelling personal anecdote about a close friend of his to illustrate this mindset shift. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, this friend lost his highly stable, lucrative corporate job literally overnight. The safety net vanished.
But Riker makes a massive leap here, connecting the 2008 financial crash to traditional Stoicism.
How does he actually justify that connection in the text? Because on the surface, those seem like two very different things.
The connection Riker makes is entirely about the response to the crisis.
According to Riker, instead of wallowing in self-pity, blaming the banks, or waiting for a government handout, which he views as the modern feminized response, this man tapped into his natural stoic male spirit.
He accepted the harsh reality without emotion. He retreated to his garage with whatever tools he had, taught himself carpentry, and started building custom furniture with his own two hands.
Riker details how the man worked incredibly long hours, pouring his frustration into physical creation.
Within 5 years, that desperate garage project had grown into a multi-million-dollar custom furniture business.
Riker uses this specific story to illustrate the raw, unstoppable power of male resilience and ingenuity when it is finally unshackled from societal expectations of victimhood and corporate dependency.
It's a powerful narrative of self-reliance. He also looks to macro history to prove his point about male leadership, pointing specifically to the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.
Riker argues that Rome expanded, conquered, and thrived under ruthless, highly decisive, and unapologetic masculine leadership.
He asserts that the empire's eventual catastrophic decline directly coincided with prolonged periods of internal decadence, the softening of traditional gender roles, and what he explicitly terms effeminacy within the ruling class.
When the men grew soft, the empire fell.
He draws a direct, provocative parallel from Rome to the 1950s in America. He argues the post-war 1950s was an era of unprecedented societal strength, massive economic boom, and cultural cohesion, precisely because boys were openly, structurally encouraged to be strong, to be providers, and to be dominant leaders, rather than being constantly told to suppress their core nature and apologize for their masculinity.
Which brings us to the ultimate radical conclusion of Riker's entire philosophy. If the institutions are fundamentally captured, if the media is relentlessly hostile, and the very structure of modern society wants to suppress your basic male biology, what is the actual practical answer?
Here's where it gets really interesting. In the final and most controversial chapters of the book, Riker fully introduces the listener to the core philosophy of MGTOW, men going their own way.
We've touched on the edges of this throughout, but here he lays out the actual blueprint. This isn't just about avoiding marriage. It is a comprehensive philosophy about building legacy, forging true brotherhood, and executing a complete radical paradigm shift for the future of masculinity.
He diagnoses a profound, inescapable issue he calls the provider paradox, which he claims is the engine of modern male misery.
Modern society absolutely demands that men continue to be the primary financial providers, what he bluntly calls being a walking ATM for their families and the state.
But simultaneously, society now demands they be flawlessly emotionally present, endlessly vulnerable, and heavily domestic. They must conquer the boardroom and flawlessly manage the emotional labor of the household.
He argues this paradox creates a massive fatherhood vacuum. Men are expected to do everything, provide everything, and absorb all stress, but they are fundamentally respected for nothing.
They have responsibilities, but zero corresponding authority.
To vividly illustrate the only viable escape from this paradox, Riker shares the deeply detailed story of John, a 35-year-old software engineer.
This is a different John than our earlier anecdote, but just as instructive. Riker explains how John spent his entire adult life desperately trying to live up to modern, feminist-approved ideals of manhood.
He constantly suppressed his natural instincts, apologized for his masculinity, went to therapy to be more vulnerable, and constantly tried to be the sensitive guy society explicitly asked for.
And according to Riker's detailed account, John was absolutely clinically miserable. He was depressed, anxious, and deeply unfulfilled, despite doing everything right.
But then, John discovered the MGTOW philosophy online. It was a revelation. He realized he didn't have to play a game where the rules were rigged against him.
So Riker details John's systematic withdrawal. John quit his soul-crushing, high-stress corporate job.
He completely abandoned the modern dating market, recognizing it as a system that viewed him only as a financial utility.
He downsized his life, moved out of the city, and started his own quiet, independent woodworking business.
John chose to focus entirely, selfishly, on his own goals, his own peace of mind, and his own absolute independence, completely free from female expectation or societal judgment.
Riker argues this specific path of withdrawal and refocusing is the only remaining path to true, lasting fulfillment for men today. He calls it the legacy loop.
Instead of seeking fleeting, short-term validation from women or a society that inherently hates them, Riker urges men to focus entirely on long-term independent creation.
He tells men to write books, to meticulously restore classic cars, to build massive self-sustaining businesses.
And crucially, to mentor young boys who desperately need strong, unapologetic male role models outside the captured education system.
Riker's final call to action for the listener is emphatic, almost militant in its urgency. He demands that men actively build their own parallel physical communities, brotherhoods that unabashedly celebrate traditional masculinity and merit.
He tells men to completely and utterly reject the mainstream narrative, to immediately stop apologizing for being men, and to step up to their natural biological role as the architects and defenders of civilization.
He reminds the listener, quite forcefully and with a barrage of historical facts, that it was men who invented the wheel, the printing press, the combustion engine, and the internet.
Men built the skyscrapers that define our cities, laid the transatlantic cables, and fought the brutal wars that secured our borders.
He argues that civilization itself fundamentally relies entirely on male innovation, male sweat, and male protection.
He concludes that it is time for men to stop sacrificing themselves for an ungrateful system, to go their own way, and by doing so, eventually force society to recognize their indispensable value.
It is a sweeping, unapologetic, and highly controversial vision of a completely fractured, yet supposedly rebuilt society based on a strict return to evolutionary gender roles and male independence.
It truly is. To summarize our deep dive today, we have thoroughly unpacked Conrad Riker's intense, meticulously structured, and unapologetic roadmap for men.
We've explored his deeply controversial arguments on exactly how men can reclaim their power and sanity from what he defines as a fundamentally broken, hostile, gynocratic system.
We've looked at the terrifying mechanics of the red pill matrix, the financial devastation of the marriage plantation, the bureaucratic weaponization of our institutions, the media's deliberate war on male heroes, and his ultimate call to embrace the biological imperative of the alpha male through the MGTOW philosophy.
Just to reiterate our stance, our goal today was to dive deep into these deeply controversial and thought-provoking arguments directly from the source text,
providing you with a comprehensive, analytical understanding of the MGTOW perspective, exactly as Riker presents it. And before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought, something to really mull over, based on the profound societal shifts we've discussed today.
This raises an important question regarding the endgame of this entire philosophy. If this masculine renaissance and the MGTOW movement successfully inspire millions of highly competent, productive men to literally pull away from mainstream institutions, completely abandoning traditional marriage, leaving corporate structures, starving the tax base, and building their own parallel, entirely male-centric communities, how will this fundamental, widespread separation alter the basic fabric of future societal cooperation and the very nature of the human family unit in the decades to come?
If the two halves of society definitively refuse to play the same game, what exactly does the next civilization look like?
A profound, potentially unsettling question to end on. It challenges the very foundation of how we assume society will function tomorrow.
Absolutely. If this incredibly thorough deep dive sparked your interest, if you want to verify the data we discussed, or if you want to read the source material for yourself, go buy Men Going Their Own Way by Conrad Riker. It is available right now as an ebook on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And be sure to stay updated on his ongoing unfiltered work by following the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep End today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a deep dive into the texts shaping our world. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative, keep learning, and keep diving deep.